Welcome to the seventh installment of Understanding the Science webinar series. In this episode, we delve into the regeneration of giant sequoia groves following the 2021 KNP complex fire in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. Our expert speakers explore the crucial role that high-severity fire plays in the reproductive process of these majestic serotinous conifers, challenging current fire prevention plans and tree planting activities within these unique ecosystems. Throughout the webinar, our speakers discussed their recent study, which revealed that high-severity fire areas promote greater giant sequoia seedling dominance and growth compared to low and moderate severity areas. Additionally, they examined the risks associated with the National Park Service's efforts to, quote, fix this natural system and emphasized the importance of reevaluating current practices to ensure the long-term survival of these remarkable trees. Join us as our speakers navigate the relationship between fire and the regeneration of giant sequoias and shed light on the implications of human intervention on this delicate balance.
In 2021, the KNP complex fire burned through one of the largest extant giant sequoia groves, killing many of the mature trees in large high-severity burn patches. We had the unique opportunity to spend time in the burn portion of this grove, collecting data that is summarized in our research publication found in the journal Fire. Next slide, Jen.
Oh, sorry. Just a minute. There we go.
There are approximately 70 groves of giant sequoias located on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. The majority of these are located in the southern portion of the range, and these are indicated on the map in red. Sequoia National Park was established in 1890 to protect the sequoia and was the first national park created to protect a living organism. This was immediately followed by the creation of General Grant National State Park, Kings Canyon National Park, General Grant National Park in the same year, which was eventually enveloped into Kings Canyon National Park in 1940. The black outlines are the current Kings Canyon and Sequoia National Park boundaries. Under the U.S. Department of Interior, the National Park Service was instituted in 1916 with the purpose to conserve the scenery, natural and historic objects, and the wildlife therein, leaving them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Okay, next slide. Since the establishment of Sequoia National Park and throughout the range of the giant sequoia groves, there's been a deficit of fire until recently. The first reintroduction of large fire to a sequoia grove in well over 125 years was the Rough Fire of 2015. Up to this point, the lack of fire has resulted in low recruitment rates, skewed age class, a variability due to the absence of younger generations of sequoia. This is an issue of concern in maintaining equilibrium of a healthy population. Giant sequoia trees are a serotinous species, meaning that they evolved with fire and have developed reproductive mechanisms physically dependent on the heat produced by fire to open the cones, melt the resin in the cones, and release the seeds. In addition, they need the nutrient-rich soils created by fire for seeds to germinate, and sun exposure for seedlings to grow and establish, a condition created by reduced canopy and found in moderate to high severity burn landscapes. Okay, Jen, next one. Since 2015, there have been 11 fires that have overlapped with the giant sequoia groves. The largest of these fires are shown on this slide and are represented by the gray shaded areas. The Kings Canyon Sequoia National Park boundaries are outlined in black. The giant sequoia groves are shown in red, and the KNP complex fire, where our study and the Redwood Mountain Grove is located, is outlined in turquoise. Next slide. The first European written observation of giant sequoias was in 1833 by the Walker Party while crossing the Sierras. In 1852, a second documentation was made by a hunter named Dowd. In 1856, logging of these trees began. In the 1870s, evidence of burning dropped off as Native American burn practices declined. And in 1900, fire had disappeared altogether in the sequoia groves, and there was an active management effort to suppress all fires on public lands. In 1912, John Muir was the first to start studying the giant sequoia. From the 1930s to present day, there have been a few small groups of dedicated researchers that have studied different aspects of the giant sequoia ecology, information that have greatly increased our knowledge and understanding of the species. However, research wasn't able to be conducted on the giant sequoia's response to large high-severity fire until after 2015. And since 2015, there are limited research studies on the subject. Finally, it is important to recognize the potential lifespan of this species, where one of the oldest recorded giant sequoia trees has been determined by ring growth records and was suggested to be 3,220 years old. In contrast, if you look at European history and exposure to the giants, it's been 191 years. 5.9% of the total lifespan of the oldest giant sequoia record, and the extent of our scientific research began only 112 years ago, less than 3.5% of the tree's potential lifespan. Next slide. Following the 2021 K&P complex fire, Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park created a plan to plant thousands of giant sequoia seedlings and other conifer species throughout areas burned at high severity in giant sequoia groves within the park boundary. My colleagues and I had some concerns regarding this project, feeling that assumptions were being made that were not supported by enough research. Namely, the assumption that the large high-severity burn patches would not naturally regenerate on their own without ecological interventions. We had concerns regarding implementation of an unprecedented and untested experiment with potential to introduce pathogens and invasive species into a pristine landscape, as well as consequences of structural genetic manipulation. Finally, it seemed to be undertaking extraordinary measures and potentially damaging ecological repercussions, disruption to wildlife, and impacts to the natural ecology. Some of these planned activities were to occur in wilderness areas and included using explosives and chainsaws to remove burned trees, snags, use of helicopters, removing up to 10 snags for each helicopter landing created, use of mule trains, large field crews, camping for long periods of time with potential damage to naturally regenerating seedlings, and disturbance to wildlife species. Next slide. So the most important question really is management intervention required? We feel that management should be based on scientific evidence comprised of research specific to the giant sequoia relationship to high severity fire. It should be the field work, the sampling, the observations, and scientific findings that determine if intervention is essential. There's much yet to learn about the relationship between giant sequoias and high severity fire, the long absence of fire from the landscape, and the recent wildfires that have burned through the sequoia groves allow us an opportunity to learn more about the resilience, succession, and mechanisms of the sequoia grove ecosystems. And Maya's going to talk more about the ecosystem and some of the species that use it.
Thanks, Tanya.
Hi, thanks, Jen. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Go ahead, Jen.
Thank you.
Thanks for the first slide, and thanks everyone for being here. This is a photo of giant sequoia seedlings within Redwood Mountain Grove. That's where I'm going to start, which is where we worked for this particular study. And you can see growth of mostly 2-year-olds and some 1-year-olds in brilliant sunlight in southern portion of Redwood Mountain Grove that Tanya just talked about. And it's spans, the high, intensely burned, high severity patch. It spans about 150 acres, a little over 150 acres. and it burned during the 2021 complex fire. So this is 2 years and 1 year after. So it was really cool. It was to see a lot of the little 1-year-olds coming out in the second year, because that would have escaped the attention of anyone looking before those 1-year-olds were starting to get established. And that's, I think, one of the key findings, that we sort of had an opportunity to look at what was coming up, really new, really young. And the level of regen here, yeah, it is a lot. It's what I find very interesting is there's, of course, you can see the snags in the background, and then you can see this log that a fallen tree or fallen part of a tree in the backdrop, which sort of offers that little microclimate that seems to work really well for some areas and the regrowth. And then the other thing I want to say is that it's kind of characteristic of a lot of areas. I'm not saying everything, not all areas, because it was always a patchwork quilt, variable density, but it's definitely characteristic of a lot of areas where you just have to be very careful walking because you don't want to trample any of these little new growth. So next slide, please. This is an animal that's pretty rare to the Southern Sierra. And actually this particular shot is taken in the northern coastal range in Mendocino. But what's common between the two is that, as you can see from the backdrop and from the log the fish are standing on, is that it's an intensely burned area, actually, in Mendocino. So this was the 2020 August complex fire, and I believe 4 fissures were found here. They just based on, the certain markings in the fissure. So it's immediately being occupied and by this rare mammal that's actually a smaller sort of relative of the wolverine, and it's endangered in the southern sequoias. And one of the first studies of fissure presence in the sequoias, in the Sequoia National Monument and Sequoia National Forest, was by Chad Hansen in 2015. I really got interested because it looked like female fissures, and this one looks like a female, were using intensely burned patches of forest, which was phenomenal. Next slide, please. Another fissure in a different part of Mendocino. So here again, you can see quite a lot of evidence of burn area around it. And this area actually is regenerating quite rapidly right now, but in the very, very earliest stages, this area didn't show the kind of regeneration that is there right now. So this is what ends up happening and has happened right now in these creek corridors close to where this camera was located, is that they end up being very rich, complex habitats that end up supporting the fisher for hunting, as well as just basically scouting around in its territory. Next slide, please. And the regeneration of giant sequoias was not confined to just the 2021 KNP complex fire. This is in the 2020 Castle fire, the Freeman Grove. You can see it's all snowed in, and there's sort of a Charlie Brown Christmas tree type of young giant sequoia in the foreground. But of course, if you look carefully in the background, there's lots of regeneration there. And this is a high severity patch, although if you look carefully in the distance, in the far distance, there are some live trees. But this particular corridor and patch is all intensely burned during the 2020 fire. Next slide. And I guess the question is how, this is footage, of course. How active are these fissures in these areas in intensely burned patches? And it is known that they're going to use complex habitat and that small mammal prey are available. I'm assuming this fissure is digging around because it senses small mammal prey. And also, it's interesting to note that this particular area, there's a fallen log, and he's digging under that fallen log. So it's not just that they're passing through. What's interesting to me personally is that they're actually spending time in these areas. Next slide. So the question is fissure present in the areas where sequoias have experienced wildfire? Now, a couple of slides ago, there was the snow backdrop with a lot of young giant sequoias reestablishing from the Castle Fire. And this is that same area. This is about 500 feet away. You've seen the fallen logs, and can this one be played too? Something's about to happen here. Anyway, so it's very evident that small mammals are using it, and also that they also use this structural complexity that is offered by the unique snag forest habitat. That includes standing trees as well as fallen logs, and of course all the complex habitat complexity offered by this growing regeneration. Next slide. And that previous slide was Sequoia National Forest. This is Sequoia National Monument. Actually, I think both are Sequoia National Monument. This is an area closer to Johnsondale. And what's interesting to me is not only, by the way, this area does not look like an intensely burned patch, but if you go up the hills on either side of this is a sort of a riparian corridor, it is intensely burned. And so this corridor offers that wonderful connectivity and of course prey base. This fissure, if it's possible to look closely at what's in her mouth, it's the head of a hawk. So she's been hunting quite actively in this patch. And I can't imagine that she would have traveled all the way from a less intensely burned area, because it's this whole entire corridor is literally surrounded by intensely burned forest. So she's definitely been using it for hunting purposes, which to me is really interesting. And it's the first time I've seen that evidence. Next slide. We're back to Sequoia National Park, one of the areas of Redwood Mountain Grove. I just wanted to, I mentioned earlier the variability, and here you see a lot of the other plants mixed in with the giant sequoias. The young giant sequoias are in the foreground alongside this sort of broken off log. And then in the background, you see the other herbaceous plants, some of the fiddleneck, I think, in the foreground also. So it's not that one set of plants is excluding another. It looks like there's a lot of intermixing, and that's one of the things we noticed time and time again during the measurements out there. Fortunate enough to be there, I think about 5 times last year. Next slide. I just wanted to point out the young bear in spring, and this is using, I guess it was, let's see, it's a 2023, and he or she is using a fallen log. This is something I've observed a lot, is this beautiful complex habitat that regrows. Now this is 10 years after the 2013 rim fire. So this beautiful complexity that just keeps increasing. And we're looking forward. This is a sort of a looking forward slide. We're looking forward to further explorations in the giant sequoias to see how that habitat complexity offers wonderful, unique opportunities to small and large mammals. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Maya. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll go to Bryant.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my PowerPoint real quick. Okay, so hi, my name is Bryant Baker. I'm with the Wildland Mapping Institute. I do a lot of our GIS work. So I did get to go out in the field a little bit last year with everyone, and that was awesome. But these other folks are the true field rock stars and have spent way more time out in the field just in general than me. But I get to kind of hang back and do a lot of the preliminary work in terms of mapping out, where we're going to be, basically setting up our transects, like where the plot locations are going to be. And Craig's going to talk more about our sort of study design. But I wanted to go back a little bit to give you a bit more context about fire and sequoia groves over the last 10 years. And so Tanya touched on this a bit, but I'm gonna go just a little bit deeper here. And so this is the Sierra Nevada ecoregion over here, and you can see these little kind of black splotches. Those are the known giant sequoia groves. They're all mapped out very, very well, actually. We've got really good maps for all of these groves, and you can see they actually go all the way. There's a little tiny dot. You probably can't see it, but it's somewhere up here. There's one in Placer County, I believe, and that's about as far north as it goes. But the majority of sequoia groves and sequoias in general are down here in the Southern Sierra Nevada. And so this is just kind of a map showing what types of federal public lands that these groves are on. And so you can see a lot of these groves are in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, and a lot are in the Giant Sequoia National Monument, which is actually just sort of a layer of it's like a national monument layer on top of existing Forest Service land. So this all used to be just purely the Sequoia National Forest, but now it has this sort of added layer of protection as the Giant Sequoia National Monument, still managed by the Forest Service. And then there's some groves that are kind of scattered on BLM land as well as private land. And so if we look at fire history just in the last 10 years, so we're going back, and it's not really 10 years since this year, but the last 10 years of data that we have, really. And so 2013 to 2022, this is when we had quite a bit of fire activity in the Southern Sierra Nevada. And I'm just showing you these kind of pink areas. Those are just fires that they're either wildfires or prescribed fires that intersected even just a little bit with a sequoia grove. And so you can see a lot of sequoia grove area that exists, especially in the Southern Sierra, has burned just in the last decade or so. And one thing that we didn't really include in our study, this is something else that we're working on, kind of another study in the works, but I think these preliminary findings might be helpful to contextualize just how much grove area has burned in the last decade and how much those groves are burning at different severities. And so you can, for those of you who like to look at numbers and tables, feel free to pay attention over here. For those of you who like a more visual representation of the data, you can check out this pie chart. It's really just telling you what's over here in the 2013 to 2022 category here. And what you'll see is that just since 2013, about almost 84% of all grove area in existence has burned in either a wildfire or a prescribed fire. So we're talking a really significant amount of sequoias have actually experienced fire very, very recently. If we go back to 1984, that number jumps up a little bit to over 90%, over 92% of these grove area, this total grove area has burned. And if you look at the severity of these fires, so I'm going to assume that prescribed fire is low severity. So just kind of, and you'll see that I group that together down here. But let's look at just wildfire. You'll see that of the area of all of the grove area that exists, about 68% of it has burned in a wildfire that burned at low to moderate severity. Another almost 4% burned in a prescribed fire across the same time period as well. And so I would say, yeah, so close to 12% of the total grove area that exists has burned at high severity since 2013. And then there's still a relatively small portion that has not burned at all during that time period. And so, what we were really wanting to focus on for this study is this one grove and this one fire. But I want to tell you a little bit more about the KMP complex, and that's what you see here in this red outline. So we're going to kind of zoom in on that, and we're going to look at the fire severity. So this was from a program called the Rapid Assessment of Vegetation. I forget what RAVAGE stands for now that I'm thinking about it. We call it RAVAGE. That's the sort of acronym for it. And it's this program where they try to get really early, like very soon after a fire, they get all this information about fire severity. And that's really based on the changes to the vegetation from before the fire to right after the fire. And so that's what we had available at the time that we did this study. And so this is what you're seeing here are these ravage data. And we can still see these dark kind of patches. Those are the sequoia groves. This one is the redwood mountain grove up here. And you'll see that there are a lot of groves that were affected by this one fire. And so if you kind of just come over here, what you're seeing this map, but just confined to the actual sequoia groves. And what you might notice is that most of the groves that actually were affected by the KMP complex, they mostly burned at relatively low severity, mainly low severity. So we're talking less than 25% of trees were killed. And a lot of times in the sequoia groves, if you were looking at just sequoia mortality, it's going to be even lower than that. So maybe you had some understory, other trees like white fir or Jeffrey pine or ponderosa pine, maybe some of those died. But generally in those low severity areas, you have very little sequoia mortality at all. And you see that there's a lot of low severity, there's some moderate severity. And then there were two groves that actually experienced sort of a significant amount of high severity. If you go by the total amount of high severity, most of that from this fire is in this one grove called the Redwood Mountain Grove. There was this other grove, I'm not going to really get into that much. It did burn it had a lot of high severity as well. And I'll show you some images that I think can kind of help you understand what these groves sort of look like after the fire. And now we're looking at aerial imagery. So you're looking down on the canopies from the air. And so what I've got here, I'm going to show you two slides where I'm basically pointing out all of these groves except for the Redwood Mountain Grove. But I'm pointing out all these other groves. And we're looking at post-fire aerial imagery. And so you can see how in some cases, like you have a lot of pretty intensely burned area around the groves, but the groves themselves are largely, very green still, very little mortality. And so this is that one other grove that had quite a bit of high severity in it. But even this grove, it's a very small grove. You have surviving mature sequoias scattered all throughout this grove. And so even in the high severity areas, there were quite a few mature sequoias that survived. These are some of the more southern groves, and you see the same pattern, right? You see that the groves are largely experiencing low severity fire. And this is something that's relatively true across the whole southern Sierra Nevada in other fires as well. Most of the time, we're seeing this low to moderate severity pattern play out in the groves. But we do have some areas that have experienced these bigger high severity patches. And that's what we were really interested in. That's why we were in part drawn to the Redwood Mountain Grove. And so this grove, it's a huge grove. It's the biggest one that was affected by the KMP complex. And by far, it had the most high severity fire effects by area. And so a lot of that is really down here in the southern portion of the grove. And there are some patches kind of, if you know this area at all, this is General's Highway, goes up here. And so you cross right by the grove along that highway. And so there were some high severity patches up in that area, but they were pretty small. So we were really focused on this really big high severity patch down there. What I think is interesting about this grove is, and this is something that we see really across all of the groves that were affected by the KMP complex, you actually see that when you compare them to the rest of the area that burned. So if you look at the whole fire, there was quite a bit of high severity fire. This was a little bit more than we've seen in other fires, a little bit less than others, but 34% of the fire, at least according to this Ravage data set, had burned at high severity. But in the groves, in the Sequoia groves, you actually see quite a bit less high severity. And so these groves are just sort of naturally, they just don't, how to put it, they tend to experience low to moderate severity, but you do get these occasional big high severity patches. And that's what we saw with the Redwood Mountain Grove. And what's interesting is if you look at Redwood Mountain, the amount of high severity fire, so that it was about 26% of the grove burned at high severity fire. And because this grove is so big, and because you had a little bit over a quarter of the grove burn at high severity, what's interesting is that high severity accounts for almost a quarter of all high severity fire that affected Sequoia groves between 2013 and 2022. So this grove, what we're learning from it is actually really important because this is where a lot of high severity fire was concentrated in terms of Sequoia groves. And it can tell us something about future fires that affect Sequoia groves. So I'm going to end there and pass it over to Craig, who is going to talk a little bit more about some of our methods. And I think, Jen, you'll have to share your screen. Yeah.
Getting it ready. Just a second. Thank you. Okay. Go ahead, Craig.
Okay, there we go. Hi, I'm Craig Swalgard, and I've been working with Chad and these other folks here on this study, along with other projects that we have going on in the Sierra Nevada. But I'm going to share with you a little bit about what our methods were and what we did and why we did what we did. Let's start with this first slide here. You've already seen some photographs of like on the left here of regeneration of sequoias, and what surprised me when I went there was the amount of regeneration that I saw, and that's just of course subjective, but it was pretty amazing. And there were other conifers coming up, but not with the resiliency that I saw in the sequoias. So, and you can see on the right, there's a photograph just to kind of remind us that other trees, the smaller trees, burn a lot faster and a lot more ferociously than the same fire might do to a sequoia. So it takes a lot to get these sequoias affected by anything. So could we go to the next slide? Okay, thank you. Okay, well, first off, let's talk about what the purpose of us going out into the field was. In general, it was to investigate sequoia regeneration after this 2021 KNP fire, and to answer some questions which we have here in the form of null hypotheses. So there's 4 of them. The first one being, we were saying in our hypothesis, our null hypothesis, that sequoia seedling density is not correlated with distance from the place where there's live seed sources in high severity burn fires. So that's something that I think national parks had been talking about, that there was a correlation. And so we thought that'd be one of the things that we wanted to test. The second one is that sequoia seedling density itself doesn't differ between the high severity and the low and moderate severity burn areas. In other words, it's all equal. The third is the proportion of sequoia seedlings to seedlings of other conifers aren't going to differ between the high severity and low to moderate severity burn areas. So there are other conifers there, and they all have their own natural way of doing what they do as species. So, and finally, number 4, we were looking at the height, and we were basically this hypothesis says sequoia seedling height does not differ between high severity and low to moderate severity burn areas. So we measured in each plot that we went to, we measured the tallest of the sequoia seedlings to answer that question. Why don't we go to the next slide? Okay, for hypothesis 1, we handled that separately. And as you can see on the right, there's a map showing the 4 transects that we selected a priori, which means that what we did was we selected them without going into the field. There was no bias or nothing that made us want to select one side over the other. And so they were selected by looking at satellite imagery. And in each one of these transects, we had 8 plots that were separated by 100 meters. And there was one plot that was unusable because it didn't follow the protocol of what we wanted in terms of there being a sequoia within 100 meters. And so we have a total of 31 plots that we got samples from. So the distance that we measured to the closest live seed source was done with a laser hypsometer. And I didn't know what they were called. I've used them before, and now I can barely pronounce the darn thing, but that's what we used from the center of the plot to the nearest seed-bearing sequoia. Next. Thanks. The other 3 hypotheses we tested using 5 other transects. And as you can see, looking to the right there, half of the transect is in high severity and the other half is in low severity, which we gathered the data from between September 29th and October 11th of last year. It was important to get it in a short period of time and not have to leave for a season and come back. We wanted to get all the data at the same time. So we have 15 plots in high severity and 15 in low severity. Okay, the seedling density, once we counted the sequoia seedlings, actually, let me correct that. Actually, counting the seedlings, we used what's called a variable radius plot. And let's go to the next slide and I can show you what it looks like. Thanks. Okay, variable radius plots are basically gives the people, that gives us the chance to have more than one chance to count sequoias in a defined area. So we go out from the pole or the stick that we have in the middle of the plot. We go out 1 meter in all directions in a circular plot. We count all the sequoias in there. Now, what if there's no sequoias at all? Well, we go to the next radius, which is 2 meters. If we didn't find anything there, we extended it to 5 meters, and then finally to 10 meters. If there wasn't anything in 10 meters, it was just a 0. So, and from our count of sequoia seedlings and conifer seedlings, other conifers, we were able to calculate the density of the seedlings per unit area. Next slide, please. Okay, this gives you an idea of the variability of what we saw once we were out there. So these are both the radius, variable radius plots, and we had strings that stretched out to 1 meter. You can see on the left, in this case, it was a plot that had almost no sequoias in the first meter. I think in the middle there, over there by the pole, you can see there's one lonely sequoia seedling. On the right, though, we had many. And so we would just stop whenever we started finding sequoias, that's where we stopped. We stopped at that radius, and we just factored that into the calculation. Okay, next one. Okay, here's some other shots. I have a lot of shots of sequoias popping up all over the place because honestly, when you get there, and when we were looking in the plots, we were counting the other conifers, but they were a little more difficult to find than the sequoias because the sequoias were popping up and growing so fast in that, and most of them I think were coming up in the last year. So I was impressed myself by that. I didn't know what to expect when I got there, but you can see on the left that I think that there was 2 or 3 sequoias all coming up together over there next to that burned stick. And on the right, we have, there wasn't a plot put there, but that's an example of how thick it could get after a fire. Next slide, please. And then finally, we wanted to compare the tallest sequoia seedling in height, in high severity, and in low to moderate severity. So I'll let Chad share some of the heights of some of these seedlings, but it was really pretty amazing how, and especially in high severity areas, this was something that was impressive just walking out there. We saw some pretty tall seedlings for only having had maybe a year's time to grow. So, and I believe the one on the right, I'm not sure, that might have been the tallest one that we saw, but I'm not sure about that. But anyway, these are some examples of what we were looking at. So final slide, please. Okay, I left these at the end to show you some of the people that did the work here. It was great working with them. And we designed the methodology to minimize the bias that might come out from not thinking ahead of time about making all things equal. And the variable plot radius method is really good for that. And I think that pretty much covers it for the methods. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Chad Hansen with the John Muir Project, and big thanks to all of my co-authors, co-researchers on this study for their wonderful presentations, and thanks to Jen for facilitating the webinar. All right, so I'm just going to talk about the results. Basically, you know, as Craig laid out, we had 4 null hypotheses. That's a common practice in science. You basically assume there's no effect, and then you measure, you gather the data, and you see if the data matches that assumption that there's no effect. If there is an effect, then the null hypothesis gets rejected. Next slide, please. Now, as Craig mentioned, in the high-intensity fire patch in the Redwood Mountain Grove, you know, certainly the sequoia regeneration was variable, but in most places it was really pretty dense. In some places it was extraordinarily dense. That was very common, where you really had to be careful. You had to watch how you walk. You had to, you know, be careful and not walk in a straight line so you didn't step on them. This is a couple of examples here of the amazing regeneration. You know, pretty much all the green you see is our sequoia seedlings. Next slide. And this is our longtime friend and colleague, Ara Marderosian with Sequoia Forest Keeper. This is deep inside the large high-intensity fire patch in the Redwood Mountain Grove. This photo was taken in September. I took this in September of 2023. And you can see what's really interesting. You know, these are giant sequoias, you know, seedlings that you're seeing here, and a little bit of shrub cover too. But when we first started our fieldwork in late June, about the tallest sequoia seedlings that we found were around 10, 11, maybe 12 inches tall. But by late September of the same year, the tallest ones we were finding were 2.5 feet tall. We found one that was 3 feet tall. That one was not in any of our plots, but we found it walking in between plots. But the point is, there were a lot of them that were over 1.5 feet tall, 2 feet tall, more than 2 feet tall. And you can see this just by looking at this picture with Ara here. And it just shows the remarkable growth because, some of these germinated in the first year post-fire. And so we called them, 2-year-olds. But and then the ones that germinated last year, we were calling 1-year-olds. But in reality, they're actually less than that because nothing germinates until the first spring after the fire. And so the oldest ones were really about 16 months old when we were measuring them. It's just extraordinary. Next slide. And, in some areas in the high intensity fire patch, the density was lower. Most areas had thousands per acre or tens of thousands per acre in the large high intensity fire patch of sequoia seedlings. Some areas had hundreds per acre, and a very small percentage had dozens per acre. It's really interesting to think about that because there's nothing wrong with having 50,000 per acre or having 50 per acre if they're growing nicely and they're surviving well, which is what they are. They're growing very, very well. Next slide. And this is a picture of one of the low moderate intensity areas. The sequoia seedling is there on the left, and then you've got fir on the right. And this was common there. You've got sequoia seedlings mixed with fir and cedar. The sequoia seedlings aren't as numerous. They're much shorter, and they're generally mixed with other conifer species. Next slide. And this is another example. A lot of them are really, really small in the low, especially in the really low severity areas. A lot of them are just a couple of few inches tall, and when they're that small and they're growing that slowly, the mortality is typically going to be higher. So what has emerged from the research is that survival of giant sequoia seedlings is about 10 times higher in the high intensity fire areas than it is in low intensity areas, which is really remarkable. Next slide. All right, so down to the basic results. We found that there was no relationship between the distance from our plots to the nearest live surviving giant sequoia and the density of giant sequoia seedling regeneration. So in other words, the sequoia seedling regeneration did not depend on having a live surviving giant sequoia seed source nearby. That was not a significant relationship, and it wasn't marginally significant either. Which is really interesting because, as mentioned by some of my colleagues, the Park Service had just made the assumption that if there wasn't a live sequoia nearby, that the area couldn't regenerate. And we found that that was absolutely not true. In fact, some of our areas had over 100,000 or so or more sequoia seedlings per acre. Over 180 to 200,000 or more per hectare, and they were more than 200 meters away from the nearest live surviving sequoia, which is really interesting. Next slide. All right, and so for the three other hypotheses, when we compared directly regeneration in high severity versus the adjacent low moderate severity areas, if you look at that middle column there where it says the median, LM is low moderate, HS is high severity. And what you can see is, in terms of fire severity, the median sequoia seedling density was much higher in the high severity, 12,732 per hectare, whereas it was 3,183 per hectare in low and moderate severity. Now, that finding was not statistically significant, probably because there was a lot of variability in the data, maybe with a larger sample size. But certainly numerically, there was a pretty dramatic difference. We suspect that difference will grow with more years post-fire based on some previous research by other scientists. And then if you look at the dominance, Sequoia dominance, Sequoias were about 100% of the conifer regeneration in the high severity fire patch, and they were 69% in the low moderate. And so, significant amount of other conifer species. In terms of growth, the sequoias in the high severity were more than 3 times taller, the tallest ones, than the tallest ones in the low moderate. These are pretty big differences. So in terms of the proportion, the dominance of sequoias, in terms of the height growth, those were very statistically significant results. So the null hypotheses were rejected. In terms of the density by fire severity, null hypothesis was not rejected. Although, though, again, there's an indication that if we had a larger sample size, that result probably would have emerged. Next slide. And so, some of the lessons emerging from our research and also from some of the literature that we've reviewed and incorporated from others that came before us, sequoia reproduction is most abundant in high-intensity fire patches, especially by several years or more post-fire. We gathered our data at 2 years post-fire, so that result didn't quite emerge there. We suspect it will in outlying years. Sequoia seedlings and saplings have by far the highest survival in high-intensity fire patches, and we certainly saw that in our study sites. And sequoia regeneration grows much faster in high-intensity patches than it does in low, moderate intensity areas. And last, sequoia seedlings are much more dominant. They comprise a much larger percentage, almost in the entirety of conifer generation in these high-intensity areas relative to low moderate. And all this suggests that sequoias actually have a competitive advantage over other conifer species in these high-intensity fire patches. That's what the data indicate to me, whereas in the low moderate intensity areas, they're growing slower, they're less numerous, they're less dominant. They actually have a competitive disadvantage relative to the other conifer species. So, the high-intensity fire patches, well, it kills most of the mature sequoias in those patches. It also spurs a massive abundance of the next generations of giant sequoias. So you get far more in the bargain relative to that mortality. And next slide. And so I'll just wrap up here with some of the reasons. Why do giant sequoias respond to high intensity fire in this way? And some of my colleagues covered some of these points, so I'll just wrap it up by summarizing. Sequoias are serotinous species. Their evolutionary history with high intensity fire goes back 90 million years, literally to the time of the dinosaurs. And they evolved to be dependent on higher intensity fire in order to effectively reproduce. It's not like you don't find any reproduction in low intensity, you do, but it tends to die much more easily. It doesn't grow nearly as fast, and it gets outcompeted. They need a lot of heat to open the cones and release seeds. And then you get the most seed release where it burns hotter. You need 100% consumption of duff and litter or close to it. So you can turn those pine needles and twigs and dry leaves on the forest floor into usable nutrients for those seedlings to use as they grow. And so their roots can actually reach soil. And then the last, of course, is you need a lot of mortality of the canopy from the fire so that the seedlings have a lot of sunlight to grow. And when you have that combination of factors, sequoia regeneration just thrives. And so I think we can open up to Q&A at this point.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Brian.
Sorry about that. The last slide. If you want more information on a lot of these issues in post-fire habitat, you can check out my book, Smokescreen.
Awesome.
Sorry, Jen. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. Thanks, everybody. I can't see the Q&A until I exit the screen.
Yeah, we typed a bunch of answers to like 11 different questions, but there are still some open questions that we haven't gotten to yet.
Okay, let's see. So Jenny would like to know, thanks for the definition of high, moderate, low severity. Can you do the same for high, medium, low intensity? Thanks.
Yeah, I can address that. technically, fire intensity is the energy release of the fire. It's the amount of energy it produces and releases. And fire severity is a measure of the percent of tree mortality. And it sounds like my colleagues already defined that in the chat. They tend to be strongly correlated. And so if a fire is very intense, it's also going to have high, if it's high intensity, it's going to have high severity. I like to use the term fire intensity generally, especially when communicating with the general public, because it's a value neutral term, whereas the term severity has a vague negative connotation. And there's so much of that in fire ecology already. I try to avoid it. So I kind of just use the term fire intensity, but we're talking about the same thing. When I say high intensity, I'm talking about areas that where most or all the trees are killed.
And I'll just add to that. I think there's a decent other reason why certainly in certain ecosystems, intensity may be a better term to discuss. And I'll just give you an example. I think that was Jenny that asked that question. So up in your neck of the woods where you have coast redwoods, where you have that's a species that is really prolific at epicormically resprouting after fire. And so you can have a really intense fire that basically completely burns the canopy and certainly makes it seem like every tree has been killed. But by the next growing season after the fire, you get most of those trees will actually have survived and they start putting out new growth on their branches and on their boles. Would high severity be the correct terminology? If you were just going by maybe the amount of live canopy that was reduced, sure, but that's not usually what we're talking about with severity. We're usually talking about tree mortality. So in that situation, you have very low tree mortality, at least in that, for those mature coast redwoods. So severity is kind of a wonky term in that situation. There are other ecosystems where you have the same problem. So it's something I would say we still need to figure out is how we talk about how the fire effects in different ecosystems.
So we have 4 questions that all go together. So I'm going to ask them all at once. What is the motivation to get in there after fire to replant without waiting for natural regeneration? Can you tell us how the Forest Service has responded to your findings? Can you help me understand the data the National Park Service misinterprets? I'm a reporter and would probably be best to continue offline. To follow up to the above question, does National Park Service question the results of your research in Redwood Canyon?
Yeah, so it seems like the first question kind of goes to some of the issues that Tanya covered in terms of, why the Park Service, kind of went ahead. But I can certainly address that too a little bit if you'd like to address that, Tanya, or if you'd like me to go first, your call.
You can go ahead, Chad.
Yeah, this is my impression. This is an educated guess. I suspect my colleagues would agree, but you can weigh in and say what you think if you think I'm right. The Park Service started proposing planting in the large high-intensity fire patch in Redwood Mountain Grove literally weeks after the KMP complex fire occurred, and several months before the first spring after the fire. So in other words, months before you could even determine whether there was any seedlings coming up, because they don't come up until the first spring after the fire. Months beforehand, they'd already made the assumption that regeneration would not occur in the large high-intensity fire patch, except right adjacent to the low moderate intensity areas, within 100 meters or less. Anything beyond that, they assumed it wouldn't regenerate. And sometimes when agencies do that and they get funding requests and they develop plans and they set the things in motion because they think they're right, when the data on the ground start indicating that they're not right, they don't want to admit that they were wrong. I feel like that's a lot of what happened here. And the more data we gathered and the more time that went on, the more it was clear that they were definitely not right. But then they just dug in more and didn't want to admit that they made a false assumption.
Malcolm wants to know, are there lessons from sequoia groves that can be applied to the Cascade Douglas fir forest in the Pacific Northwest?
Broadly, yeah. There's a lot of research on those forests in the Pacific Northwest, and they regenerate nicely after high-intensity fire too. The relationships aren't exactly the same because they're not serotinous like giant sequoias, but of course you don't have to be a serotinous species to regenerate after high-intensity fire. And of course, we found regeneration of white fir and incense cedar and Doug fir as well. So,
Kevin's wondering, how long is sequoia seed viable in soil?
I wish I knew. If anyone knows the answer to that, weigh in. But I do not know the answer, and I'm pretty sure no one does. The general impression is that the viability declines, of course, over time, and there are some data on that. But how long that tail is really unknown, honestly, because you were talking about millions and millions and millions of seeds that sequoias release, and it doesn't take many to facilitate germination. I can tell you that we and other sequoia groves have seen new seedlings at 3 years, 4 years, 5 years after high intensity fire. And so it doesn't all come in the first year or two.
The Forest Service has stated that they need to remove low vegetation that comes in after fire because it smothers tree seedlings. Do you have data on this?
We do, actually. We have a paper that has just been accepted to the journal Ecology and Evolution, where we actually address whether or not shrub cover affects the number of seedlings that we're seeing. I believe, didn't we talk about that a little bit in the Redwood Mountain study? I'm now forgetting if we
submitted that finding in our comments to the Park Service,
right,
with regard to their proposal, and we found that giant sequoia seedling density was actually positively correlated with percent shrub cover. In other words, and this was at another grove in another high-intensity fire patch at 6 years post-fire, and when shrubs were more mature. And what we found is that there were more sequoia seedlings and saplings in the areas with the highest levels of shrub cover. So completely the opposite of what the Forest Service and the Park Service have been assuming. They've been assuming that shrubs will negatively impact giant sequoia regeneration, and you'll find the lowest sequoia seedling and sapling density where shrubs are the highest. We did not find that. We found exactly the opposite. And we're the first ones to ever test that, by the way.
Kind of two questions at once. Do you have a hypothesis about how these seedlings will do in a warming climate? And what is our understanding of the role that weather or climate and winter conditions play in regeneration in the spring?
We know that there's a lot of variability in the evolutionary history of giant sequoias with regard to fire, with regard to climate. If we don't get a handle on climate change, on the climate crisis and the human activities that are driving it, it's going to affect a lot of ecosystems. And I think mostly not because of increased fire so much as because of just increasing temperatures and the rate at which temperature is increasing. You don't want too much fire. You don't want too little fire. We've actually had far, far too little fire in the giant sequoia groves over the past 125, 130 years, as Tanya mentioned, and as Bryant talked a little bit about. So the recent fires have restored some of that balance. We're still not even to normal over the course of a century, but we're closer, much closer now. We don't want to overshoot either, right? So, it's something we need to keep a close eye on. And this is what we've been urging the land management agencies to do, is to monitor these things and not make assumptions without gathering data and submitting it to the peer review process. So that's what we're doing, and we're going to keep doing that. And we hope that the land managers pay attention.
Given that there were high severity fires and the service assumed no regeneration, and that there was very little regeneration for a couple of years, it may not be that surprising the service was concerned in planting what and wanted to plant. However, now that regeneration has proved those assumptions to be false, what explains the actions that the service is planning?
Ooh, yeah. So, well, back to my point earlier, I think they felt boxed in, by their assumptions, and they just didn't want to admit they were wrong. I also think there were a lot of politics involved. There's been a kind of a drumbeat political messaging coming from certain members of Congress, some of them Republicans, some of them Democrats, and from some folks in the administration to promote this narrative that high intensity fire is categorically bad for giant sequoias, and that we only want low intensity surface fire. And I think what we're finding is you want the mix of intensities. That's all natural. This is a natural mixed intensity fire regime. It's not low intensity or high intensity. It's a mix. And so you want those high intensity fire patches to occur periodically. And in fact, I think sequoias need them. And so the political narrative is not lining up with the scientific evidence. Unfortunately, I feel like the park was under a lot of political pressure and they stuck with a political narrative. And their actions, I think, bear that out.
What about the regeneration of other tree species commonly found in giant sequoia groves, such as ponderosa pine, red fir, etc.? What fire conditions are conducive for their recovery? And then someone would like to know also, are there any tree species that do poorly in high severity fire?
Yeah, good question. They all regenerate in low, moderate, and high. They all regenerate in all areas. Some do relatively better in high intensity, and some I would say just there's a lot of research out there, and not all of it is exactly agrees. But generally speaking, I think I would say, and my colleagues weigh in and tell me what you think, because we've done a lot of work in different fires on this stuff. It seems like white fir and incense cedar tends to do. You find a lot in the high intensity for sure. You might find more in the low and moderate. The pine species, they tend to do pretty well in the high intensity fire areas, but you find them in the low and moderate too. So it really is a mix. And every time you think you've got it figured out and you think, okay, this species really is associated with low intensity fire, then you'll walk into a high intensity fire patch and find a bunch of it. But yeah, I'd be interested in my colleagues' thoughts on that too.
I have a quick comment on that, Chad, and I like how you put that. There's the Doug fir in the coastal region seems to be getting a lot of sort of bad press about how it doesn't survive wildfire. And what's really interesting is when you go up to British Columbia, the Doug fir is actually worshipped as, revered as a tree that does really well during fire and survives fire really well. It's possible that it has to reach, as far as what I can tell from various folks who I've spoken to, it just has to reach a certain size. It has to be allowed to grow to a certain size where that fire resistance picks up a lot. And the bark is super thick, and those mature Doug firs do really well. So the problem is if you're not going to let it grow beyond 60 years, then you're going to see a different type of behavior in these fires.
So all of this vegetation management that is going on in other areas, other types of forests, removing shrubs and understory, may well also be removing nursery cover for other tree species, as well as helping soil stay moist and shaded. I meant, of course, oh, sorry, it's not a question, but I mean, maybe a conversation starter, removing understory veg and shrubs that would otherwise help keep soil moist and shaded.
Yeah, I mean, this is a common, kind of industrial forestry management, assumption that you want to remove everything that's not the conifers. And so they'll oftentimes go in and you clear cut an area or go in with masticators or other means herbicides and get rid of everything that's not the conifers. And the assumption is that, then there won't be any competition. But I think in my impression and my belief based on the evidence we've gathered and the other evidence that's been published by other scientists in the field in post-fire ecology is that it's not anywhere near that simple, that there are all kinds of relationships. There are symbioses, there are commensalisms. Species benefit from each other. And oftentimes they benefit by proximity. There are mycorrhizal fungi networks under the soil that connect plants of the same species, different species. And so it's nowhere near as simple as foresters thought it was back in 1950. And so removing those understory plants is not a good idea. And based on what we're seeing, I don't think it would be good for giant sequoias, certainly.
Why not address corporate invasion? I'm not sure what that means. But yeah, there have been some questions answered live while the presentation was going on. So I can definitely go back. Can you tell us about other areas post-wildfire which y'all are studying like this? This is awesome info. Thank you. I do agree, it's awesome info. These guys are hard at work in the summers and springtime and fall. Yeah, and I'll let them answer that.
Well, I think that would be a good one for Maya, to talk about, you've spent a lot of time in the high intensity fire areas in the Freeman Creek Grove, and some of the others in the Castle fire that burned 1 year before KMP complex. Just impressions there, because I think it's important for people to know this doesn't appear to be an anomaly. What we're finding in the Redwood Mountain Grove, it's something we're seeing in other groves where high intensity fire occurred.
Yes, I agree. Thanks, Chad. And in fact, the Freeman Creek Grove corridor itself is so far very fortunately protected. But if you're driving out there and you're going to pass Needles area, which is another beautiful area that has been affected by the same wildfire, the Castle fire, unfortunately, you're just going to see a lot of removals taking place, and then a lot of markings that seemed to indicate further removals to take place. So I'm actually hoping it doesn't happen, certainly not in the Freeman Creek corridor, which is absolutely gorgeous. And that's where the photograph that I showed was taken, the little seedlings on the snow. But unfortunately, it's happening really quickly.
Yeah, one thing I'll mention there, and this is something that Tanya and I and another colleague of ours, who will, I think, hopefully be joining us on a future webinar about our next Sequoia fire study. We saw this firsthand in a different Sequoia grove, one on a national forest, where the Forest Service is doing intensive post-fire logging after the fire in a portion of the grove, and we're trying to stop that. But we really saw a lot of mortality. Most of the Sequoia seedlings and saplings had been killed where this logging occurred, because it's ground-based logging. You've got all this logging machinery, and it really it's something I think people need to know about when when they're hearing agencies say, oh, we want to go in and do restoration and reforestation and fuel reduction. Those terms sound good to a lot of people. They need to understand what that really means on the ground. Is that in many cases, it means post-fire clear-cutting herbicides and killing most of the Sequoia seedlings that were naturally growing in. And so we've seen that, all of us have seen that firsthand.
Somebody asked about why there are not any cultural burn scientists on this panel. I can answer that. Our group, our entire focus for this study was to try to understand how a large severity fire patch affects Sequoia regeneration. That's something that hasn't really been studied before. And it has a lot to do with what we've talked about several times throughout these different presentations, which is that at least in recent history over the last several decades, there just hasn't been a lot of large high severity fire patches in these groves. And so we are trying to understand how does that affect regeneration. It is nothing against cultural burning. It is just that this wasn't about a cultural burn. This was a wildfire. I forget how this fire started. This was a lightning strike fire, right, guys?
Lightning fire, yeah.
Yeah, this was a natural wildfire, we've written other papers. Some of us have co-authored other papers where we call for barriers to cultural burning to be lifted. We think that cultural fire and mixed intensity wildfire have long coexisted on the landscape prior to colonization, of course, and think that they should still in the future. So I think that's why we don't have a cultural burn expert on this panel. It's nothing against cultural burning. It's not the answer, not the question we were trying to answer. Well, unless anyone else wants to jump in on that. I don't know. Sorry.
I think Maya had a comment.
I really agree with what Brian said. And I also think that I have definitely heard people in the indigenous communities, of course, there's varying opinions, but that they are not just appreciative of cultural burning, but also the place that wildfire has, which is absolutely vital. Both are vital. And so I like to know that there are those people who are sensible about both types of fires working very well.
Yeah, I support that completely. And I think the point for me is that wildfires from lightning strikes and Native American cultural burning have both been suppressed dramatically after colonization and with fire suppression policies and logging policies. Both have been suppressed. Both are much less common now than they were historically before colonization. I believe that there's no conflict between the two. In fact, they work in harmony. We should have more of both, and administrative and political barriers to lightning strike natural wildfires and to Native American cultural burning should be reduced, removed, lifted, so that we can have more of both. And meanwhile, as Jen pointed out, we're spending our money on all the wrong things as far as wildfire, and we should be focusing it on creating fire-safe communities. So we can allow fire to happen in the wildlands, both lightning strikes and Native American cultural burning.
Well, thanks everyone that stuck with us for almost the hour and a half. I think all of the questions have been either answered written or verbal, and we will be sending out the recording hopefully next week with the questions and answers that were not answered on camera. And yeah, for any more information, please don't hesitate to reach out. And hopefully we will see you guys next time for the next wildfire study. Thanks, guys.